Alfred, later known as the Great, entered the world in a time of peril and upheaval. He was born in the year 849 in the village of Wantage, in the kingdom of Wessex, the youngest son of King Ethelwulf and his queen, Osper. Wessex, the great Saxon kingdom in southern England, was both blessed and cursed in his day. Blessed with fertile lands and a deep Christian heritage, cursed with constant raids from the seafaring Danes who plundered monasteries and burned towns along the coasts. It was into this world of fear and faith that Alfred first opened his eyes. He was the youngest of 6 children, and so from the beginning Alfred seemed unlikely ever to wear the crown. His older brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Athelred, were all ahead of him in line for succession, and yet, even as a child, Alfred carried a quiet gravity, a certain watchfulness that made others feel he was destined for something more than the life of a younger royal son. Osper, his mother, was a woman of refinement and learning, and it was she who first lit the spark of love for books and holy things in Alfred's heart. One story, preserved by Asser, Alfred's friend and later biographer, tells of how Osper gathered her sons and showed them a richly illuminated book of Saxon poetry. Its pages were adorned with colored initials, its verses alive with the stories of heroes and saints. Holding the volume before her children, she made a playful challenge. "I will give this book," she said, "to whichever you can first learn to recite its verses by heart." The older boys may have scoffed at the challenge, but young Alfred, small and quiet though he was, took it to heart. He had no formal training in letters at this time, and yet he sought out tutors and pressed himself to master the lines. In a short while he returned to his mother, reciting the poetry from memory, word for word. The book became his prize, and more than that, a symbol of his lifelong devotion to learning. In this story one can already glimpse the man Alfred would become. Not content with brute strength alone, but a lover of words, wisdom, and the pursuit of knowledge, even in a world where kings were expected to be warriors above all. When Alfred was still a child, he was chosen to accompany his father on a pilgrimage to Rome. This was no small journey for a boy of about 5 years old. The road to Rome stretched across the breadth of Frankish lands, through mountains, forests, and rivers alive with both dangers and wonders. Travelers spoke foreign tongues, wore strange clothing, and prayed in cathedrals whose size and splendor must have overwhelmed the boy from Wessex. At Rome, Alfred and his father were received by Pope Leo IV, who blessed the child and, in an act that would long be remembered, anointed him as consul, a ceremonial title connecting the young Saxon prince to the grandeur of the ancient Roman Empire. Some chroniclers later embellished this, saying Alfred had been consecrated by the Pope himself for future kingship, whether literal or symbolic. The moment stamped Alfred with a mark of divine favor in the eyes of his people. The pilgrimage left a deep impression on him. He returned to Wessex with his heart kindled by the majesty of the universal church, by the grandeur of Rome, and by the sense that God's providence guided the paths of nations. Alfred grew from that journey with a seriousness beyond his years. Where other boys chased dogs through the fields or clashed wooden swords, Alfred loved to listen to stories of saints, to chant psalms in the chapel, and to pore over whatever scraps of Latin and Saxon he could persuade monks to share with him. And yet, for all his piety, Alfred was not spared the trials of youth. He suffered from a mysterious illness that haunted him all his life. Even as a child, bouts of sudden pain, weakness, and fevers would overcome him. Some scholars think it may have been Crohn's disease, others piles, or a chronic intestinal disorder. Whatever it was, it gnawed at him unpredictably, sometimes leaving him doubled in agony. Alfred himself later wrote that he saw his affliction as a thorn in the flesh, a burden God had permitted to keep him humble, that he might never glory in his own strength but in the Lord's. For the young boy, this meant that every moment of health, every chance to learn or play, was precious. His suffering made him contemplative, sharpening the seriousness already planted in him by Rome and by his mother's teaching. The death of his mother while he was still young cast another shadow over his early years. Osburh's absence left him without the gentle guiding presence who had first drawn him toward the life of learning. His father, King Ethelwulf, loved him, but the king was often preoccupied with the defense of Wessex against Danish raids. Alfred turned inward, finding in prayer and memory the comfort he had lost in Osburh's embrace. But though his youth was marked by sorrow and illness, Alfred's boyhood also held moments of brightness and even mystical consolation. Asser records that Alfred sometimes experienced dreams of radiant light filling the church during Mass, a sense of angelic presence near the altar. These were not mere imaginings of a sickly boy, but experiences that confirmed for him the reality of God's nearness. He told his companions of a time when, kneeling before the altar, he felt his pain suddenly vanish and his body fill with warmth, as though touched by a hand unseen. Such experiences etched into him conviction that God had chosen him not for ease, but for endurance, not for worldly pleasures, but for holy labor. As Alfred grew into adolescence, he began to take more part in the life of the royal court. He learned the arts of hunting and warfare alongside his brothers. Though not as large or as physically powerful as some, he displayed a sharp, tactical mind. He listened intently to the tales of older warriors, memorizing the lessons of ambush and shield wall, of retreat and counterstrike. When he was perhaps 15, he joined his first skirmishes against Danish raiders. The Danes came in their longships, dragon-prowed and swift, striking suddenly along the coasts. Alfred watched villages burned, monasteries desecrated, and innocent peasants slain. He learned that to be a prince in Wessex was not merely to enjoy feasts in great halls, but to stand as a defender of his people against relentless enemies. One story from this time illustrates both his piety and his courage. A small band of Danes had penetrated inland and threatened a monastery that Alfred cherished. The young prince rode with a handful of retainers to confront them. The Danes mocked the youth, laughing at his small stature and pale face. Yet Alfred rallied his men, leading them in prayer before engaging. In the fight that followed, he showed both bravery and cleverness. Rather than charging recklessly, he drew the Danes into uneven ground where their numbers gave less advantage. When the raiders fled, Alfred insisted the monks gather the relics and sacred vessels left in danger. He knelt among the broken altar stones and vowed before God that he would devote his life not merely to defending Wessex, but to defending the Christian faith in his land. This blend of martial spirit and spiritual devotion would mark Alfred forever. Even in youth, he seemed to embody two worlds: the world of the warrior, hardened by battle and blood, and the world of the monk, softened by prayer and study. It was this union that would later make him not just a king, but the great. By the time Alfred was in his late teens, his father had died, and his older brothers began to take the throne in succession. Alfred remained ever the younger son, loyal and watchful, supporting his brothers as they faced the great Danish invasions that pressed upon Wessex with growing force. He could have been resentful of always standing in another's shadow, yet he bore it with humility, believing his time would come in God's providence. In these years of waiting, Alfred deepened his devotion to the church. He took special care to visit shrines, to support the work of scholars, and to spend hours in meditation. Those close to him remarked on his unusual combination of gravity and gentleness. Children were drawn to him, sensing he would not mock them. Priests trusted him with their concerns. Warriors admired his courage in battle, yet even they acknowledged that Alfred was no ordinary prince. There was something the same about him, a sense that he lived always with one ear tuned to heaven. Thus the boy who had once memorized poetry for the love of a book, who had stood before the Pope in Rome, who had battled sickness and sorrow, and who had pledged himself before a ruined altar, was being shaped by God for the role history would soon demand of him. Though still the younger son, still not yet crowned, Alfred was already carrying within him the seeds of greatness. When Alfred reached manhood, the kingdom of Wessex stood at a crossroads. The Danish threat had grown from a nuisance of raiding ships into an existential menace. No longer satisfied with plunder, the Vikings came in full armies, seeking to carve out permanent kingdoms on English soil. Northumbria and East Anglia had already fallen into their hands, and Mercia, once proud and powerful, had been battered into submission. Wessex alone remained as the last great Saxon kingdom capable of resisting them. Alfred's older brother, Athelred, was now king, and Alfred served faithfully as his right hand. From the very beginning, he displayed an instinct for strategy that outstripped most of the veteran thanes. In war councils, when older men argued for rash charges or cowardly retreats, Alfred spoke calmly, weighing terrain, supply, morale, and timing. Though not yet crowned, he already bore the heart of a king. His piety, too, remained unshaken. It was said that Alfred often withdrew to a small chapel before battles, kneeling in vigil with the Psalms open before him, sometimes reciting them in Saxon, other times attempting in halting Latin, the language of the church. More than once, soldiers glimpsed him lifting his hands heavenward in silent prayer just before mounting his horse. To many of his men, this was a source of courage. Their prince did not trust in swords alone, but in the Lord of hosts. The year 868 brought one of Alfred's earliest trials as commander. The Danish great heathen army, led by Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, swept southward. Alfred rode with Athelred into Mercia to aid their allies. The campaign was bitter, with clashes in marshes and forests, often ending in stalemate. Alfred learned firsthand how difficult it was to fight an enemy who lived from the land, moved swiftly, and feared neither hardship nor death. He also saw the ruin left in their wake, villages turned to ash, churches stripped of relics, monks slaughtered at the altar. To Alfred, this was more than politics. It was a war against Christendom itself. Yet it was in 871, the year of battles, that Alfred's life changed forever. The Danes launched a full-scale invasion of Wessex, advancing in terrifying force. King Athelred and Alfred rallied their armies and met them in a series of desperate clashes. At Reading, the Saxons were beaten back, their shield walls shattered. At Ashdown, however, fortune turned. The Battle of Ashdown is one of the great moments of Alfred's life. The Saxon army divided into two divisions, one under Athelred, the other under Alfred. When the Danes arrayed themselves upon a ridge, their standard bearing the raven banner of Odin, Athelred lingered in his tent, attending mass and refusing to mount until the priest had finished. Impatient and unwilling to let the Danes seize the high ground, Alfred made a fateful decision. He led his division uphill and struck first. The fighting was savage. The clash of shield against shield, the cries of the wounded, the stench of blood. This was no skirmish but a struggle for survival. Alfred himself fought in the thick of it, his sword flashing, his shield battered. Chroniclers tell that he pressed directly against the Danish lines, rallying his men when they faltered. At last Athelred emerged from prayer and brought his division crashing into the flank of the enemy. Between them, the brothers broke the Danes. The ridge was won, and with it, a temporary reprieve for Wessex. Though Ashdown was a victory, the year that followed brought both triumph and tragedy. The Saxons suffered defeats at Basing and Merton, their armies worn down by the relentless Danes. In April that year, Athelred died, perhaps of wounds or illness, leaving Alfred, at just 22 years old, to take up the crown. It was a heavy burden for one so young. Alfred inherited a kingdom reeling from war, its land scarred, its people weary. Yet in his coronation, held at Kingston upon Thames, he knelt before the altar with a face more solemn than triumphant. Those who witnessed it said he seemed less like a warrior claiming power than a servant kneeling to take up a cross. He prayed aloud for wisdom, for strength to protect the people, and for God's mercy upon England. His early reign was tested immediately. The Danes pressed southward with ferocity. Alfred led his weary armies into battle again and again at Wilton, where the Saxons nearly triumphed but were forced into retreat, and in countless skirmishes along the Thames Valley. Again and again, Alfred was forced to sue for peace, giving gifts of silver and promises of truce, only to see the Danes break them. Some called him weak for paying tribute, but Alfred knew his kingdom was fragile and in need of breathing space. Better to buy time than to gamble all on a single rash battle. In these years of trial, Alfred's inner life deepened. His illness continued to afflict him, at times so severely that he could not ride with his men for days. He saw in this affliction a divine test, a reminder that no king, however strong, was master of his own body. One night, as Asser later recorded, Alfred kept vigil in his chamber, racked with pain. He prayed fervently, and as dawn broke, he felt a sudden vision, Christ crowned with thorns, gazing upon him not with condemnation but with compassion. From that moment, Alfred resolved to live as much as a servant of God as a king of men. He began to practice a discipline of dividing his time between prayer, study, governance, and warfare, to mark the hours. He devised a system using candles measured by notches, each burning for a set length of time, so that his days might be balanced between the needs of his soul and his kingdom. This strange contrivance, the Alfredian candle clock, symbolizes unique blending of practicality and piety. Amid the battles, Alfred never forgot his love of learning. He lamented that so many monasteries had been destroyed by the Danes, and with them the learning of ages. The churches stand empty, the schools are silent, the young grow without letters, he once said. Even in the press of war, he began to gather scholars from Mercia and abroad, men who could read Latin and copy sacred texts, so that the faith might not perish with the flames. But the Danes were not finished. In 878 came the darkest hour of Alfred's life. The Danish king Guthrum launched a sudden midwinter assault, catching Alfred unprepared. Many of his nobles fled, others submitted. Alfred himself was driven into the marshes of Somerset, with only a small band of loyal followers. His kingdom lay shattered, and it seemed all England might fall to the heathen. Here the famous tale of Alfred and the burnt cakes belongs. Hiding in a peasant woman's hut, weary and disguised as a simple traveler, Alfred was asked to watch a batch of loaves baking while the woman tended her chores. Lost in thought about how to rally his broken people, Alfred let the bread burn. The woman scolded him sharply, unaware that the man before her was a king. Alfred, instead of rebuking her, bowed his head and accepted her anger with humility. To him, the charred loaves were a parable. Even kings may fail in small duties, and God humbles the mighty to remind them of their dependence. It was in the marshes, amid hunger and despair, that Alfred's spirit was steeled. He built a small fortress on the Isle of Athelney, and there, with a remnant of loyal warriors, began to plan the reconquest of his kingdom. He sent messengers secretly through Wessex, calling his people to arms, promising that God had not abandoned them. In those dark days, Alfred was less a king upon a throne than a prophet in the wilderness, gathering his flock anew. When spring came, his people answered. Farmers left their plows, shepherds their flocks, priests their churches, all to rally under Alfred's banner. The marshes emptied as men streamed to him, and Alfred led them toward destiny at a place called Edington. The spring of 878 was a season of destiny. From the marshes of Somerset, where Alfred had hidden as a fugitive, there came now a great gathering of men. Farmers, fishermen, monks, and thanes rallied to him, as though England itself, weary of humiliation, had chosen one last time to rise. Alfred rode among them, not as a distant sovereign, but as one who had suffered with them. His face bore the marks of illness and hardship, yet his eyes burned with purpose. To these weary men he spoke not of revenge, but of renewal. The Lord has tested us in fire, he said, but he has not abandoned his people. Now we must fight as his servants, and England shall be his again. The decisive battle came at Edington. The Danes under Guthrum held the field, hardened warriors who had known only conquest for decades. They trusted in their raven banner, a token they believed granted them victory. Alfred arrayed his Saxons in the shield wall, row upon row of interlocked shields and spears. The air was heavy with tension as both sides clashed, the crash of iron upon wood echoing across the meadow. The fighting was brutal. Time and again, the Danes pressed, hurling themselves upon the Saxon shields, hacking with axes, thrusting with spears. Alfred's men held firm, their king at the center, his sword rising and falling with relentless rhythm. At one desperate moment, when the wall began to waver, Alfred lifted his voice in a psalm. "Let God arise, and let his enemies be scattered." The men around him took up the cry, and with renewed strength they pushed forward. At last the Danish line broke. Guthrum's men fled, pursued into their camp, which Alfred's forces stormed and burned. The victory was complete. For the first time in years, Wessex had not merely survived, but triumphed. The raven banner was trampled in the mud, and the Saxons, exhausted and bloodied, lifted their king upon their shields in a cry of thanksgiving. Yet Alfred's greatness lay not only in victory, but in mercy. He could have slaughtered the Danes or driven them out. Instead, he sought a higher path. Guthrum, defeated and humiliated, was brought to Alfred's camp. There, in an extraordinary moment, the pagan warlord agreed to be baptized into the Christian faith. Alfred himself stood as Guthrum's godfather, giving him the name Athelstan. For Alfred, this was more than politics. It was a triumph of the cross over the hammer of Odin. The Treaty of Wedmore followed, dividing England between the Saxon lands and the Danelaw in the north and east. It was an uneasy peace, but it gave Wessex breathing room, and it planted the seeds of Christian order even among former foes. After Edington, Alfred turned his attention to rebuilding what had been broken. He knew that victory in one battle did not mean lasting safety. The Danes would return. New fleets would sail. If Wessex was to endure, it needed more than courage. It needed a system. Alfred, therefore, began one of the most remarkable programs of reform in the early Middle Ages. First came the defenses. Alfred studied the ways of war carefully. He realized that the old method of gathering an army only after invaders had landed was too slow. Instead, he divided his forces into rotating groups, so that one half was always in the field while the other returned home to tend their lands. This system gave him a permanent army, without destroying the livelihoods of his people. He built a network of fortified towns, called Buzz, spread across his kingdom, so that no village was more than a day's ride from refuge. These Buzz were linked by roads and garrisoned with men. To this day, many English towns trace their roots to Alfred's fortresses. He also turned his eye to the sea. The Danes had ruled the waters with their longships, but Alfred began constructing a fleet of ships larger and swifter than theirs. These sea steeds, as they were called, were designed to meet the Vikings on their own element. In time, Alfred became known as the founder of the English Navy. But Alfred was not content with military reform alone. He believed that a kingdom without wisdom and justice was doomed as surely as one without swords. He therefore set about reforming the laws of Wessex, drawing upon the old codes of his ancestors, but also upon the scriptures. Alfred issued a book of dooms, or judgments. He began it with the 10 Commandments and the teachings of Christ, followed by the laws of earlier Saxon kings. "For I dared not presume to set down much of my own," Alfred wrote humbly, "for it was unknown to me what it would please those who should come after us." In this, Alfred sought not to impose novelty, but to bind the life of his people to the eternal truths of God's Word. Perhaps most striking of all was Alfred's dedication to learning. He lamented the decline of literacy in his kingdom. "So few are they," he wrote, who can understand their service books in English or translate a letter from Latin into English, that I cannot remember a single one south of the Thames. To remedy this, he gathered scholars from across the land, and even from abroad, men like Grimbald of St. Bertin and John the Old Saxon. Together they founded schools to teach both nobles and commoners. Alfred himself took up the study of Latin in adulthood, laboring over grammar and vocabulary, so that he might read the wisdom of the Church Fathers. He translated works such as Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, Boethius' Consolation Philosophy, and Augustine's Soliloquies into Old English, adding his own prefaces that revealed a soul hungry for wisdom. One story tells of Alfred setting aside half his income for the support of scholars, the church, and the poor, while the other half went to the expenses of the court and army. In this division, one sees the two halves of Alfred himself, the warrior king and the servant of God. He believed his crown was given not for his own glory, but for the good of his people. Alfred's mystical side never vanished amid his labors. He continued to be afflicted by his mysterious illness, and in these moments of weakness, he often sought solitude in prayer. Asser records that Alfred kept the book of Psalms always near hand, and that he would break from councils or feasts to recite them quietly. He had a profound devotion to the Virgin Mary, often praying before her image for strength and guidance. In moments of great trial, he would sometimes withdraw into silence, his lips moving in prayer, as if seeking counsel from heaven before speaking. Those around him felt that Alfred's strength came not merely from his intellect or will, but from a constant communion with the divine. His reforms began to bear fruit. The buzz gave his people safety. The schools revived learning, the navy checked the Danes, and his laws gave justice. For the first time in generations, the Saxons felt not merely that they had survived, but that they were building a kingdom that could endure. Alfred himself once expressed his vision. "It is my wish to live worthily as long as I live, and after my life to leave to those who come after me the memory of me in good works." Yet Alfred knew the peace was fragile. Raiding bands of Danes still prowled, and the Danelaw remained a source of tension. But the tide had turned. Wessex was no longer a hunted remnant in the marshes, but the heart of a new hope for England. In Alfred's reign, for the first time, men began to speak of the English people as one nation. The boy who had memorized poetry for a book, the fugitive king hiding in marshes, the warrior crying psalms on the battlefield, had now become a lawgiver, builder, and teacher. His greatness lay not in one sphere alone, but in the union of them all. He was at once soldier and scholar, ruler and servant, practical and mystical. Few kings in history have carried so many burdens so well. By the late 880s, Alfred had reigned for over a decade. His kingdom, once brought to the brink of annihilation, was now stable and fortified. His reforms in law, education, and military organization had begun to take root. Wessex, long pressed by the sea raiders, now stood as the strongest of the Anglo-Saxon realms. And yet, Alfred never permitted himself to believe the struggle was finished. "So long as breath remains in me," he said once, "I will stand watch for my people, for the enemy is never far." His foresight proved true. The truce with Guthrum and the Treaty of Wedmore provided a fragile peace, but fresh Viking armies continued to arrive on English shores. Bands of raiders still struck into Saxon territory, testing the system Alfred had devised. More than once, the king himself rode swiftly to reinforce a garrison under siege. His navy, though still small, began to win occasional victories at sea, intercepting Danish ships before they reached the coast. These efforts did not end the Viking threat, but they blunted it, giving his people the sense that they were no longer helpless prey. Alfred's greatness lay not only in his victories, but in his vision. He saw beyond the momentary survival of Wessex to the larger destiny of the English people. He began to foster alliances with neighboring Mercia, ensuring that the two kingdoms would stand together against the Danes. He married his daughter Ethelflaed to Athelred, the lord of the Mercians, binding the two realms by blood as well as politics. This union would later prove vital in the reconquest of England, but even in Alfred's day it symbolized a new sense of English unity. In his court, Alfred surrounded himself with men of wisdom and faith. Asser of Wales, his friend and biographer, often described the king's unquenchable thirst for knowledge. Alfred insisted that young nobles be taught to read English, and he dreamed that every freeborn man might someday be able to read the scriptures in his own tongue. The king himself, often working late into the night, struggled over translations. He wrestled with Latin phrases, pausing to pray for light, then pressing on with determination. His translation of Gregory's Pastoral Care was not only a work of scholarship, but also a sermon to his people. In his preface, Alfred lamented the decay of learning in England and declared his intention to restore wisdom as the foundation of good rule. At times, Alfred spoke almost as a prophet. Without wisdom, he warned, no kingdom can stand. A land may be strong in arms, but if its people are blind in spirit, then it shall fall. To many who heard him, these words carried more weight than laws or decrees. They felt that their king was not merely governing, but shepherding them, binding their fate to the higher order of God's will. His personal piety grew ever deeper. Despite the burdens of kingship, Alfred never neglected the life of prayer. He attended the daily offices, often rising in the middle of the night to recite psalms by candlelight. His illness continued to afflict him, sometimes striking suddenly and leaving him weak for days. In these moments of suffering, he turned inward, offered his pain as a kind of sacrifice. Some of his companions recalled that when the attacks came upon him, Alfred would murmur quietly, "Fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done." There are stories of visions in these years. One tells that Alfred, in the midst of a sleepless night, felt himself surrounded by a brightness not candles but of heavenly light, and heard the chanting of monks though none were present. Another story, told among his household, spoke of Alfred dreaming of a great tree springing from Wessex, its branches shading all England, while the roots were watered by streams flowing from across. Such stories cannot be proven, but they capture something essential about how his people saw him, not merely as a warrior king, but as one marked by God's hand. Alfred also displayed a remarkable humility for a ruler. The tale of the burnt cakes from his time in the marshes was often retold in his later years, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with reverence. Alfred himself did not mind the story being told. "Better to be scolded for burnt bread," he once said, "than to grow proud and forget the hand of God." He welcomed correction even from common folk, and he often disguised himself to walk among his people, listening to their complaints and measuring the justice of his officials. As age advanced, Alfred devoted more time to codifying the laws and customs of his people. His legal code, which blended Mosaic commandments, Christian teaching, and ancient Saxon precedent, sought to create not just order but righteousness. He was not naive about human sin, but he believed that laws could point men toward higher standards. His dooms included protections for the poor, penalties for corruption, and safeguards for the church. His aim was not vengeance but restoration. "For justice," he said, "is a piece of the land." Though war never entirely ceased, Alfred increasingly spent his last years ensuring the stability of his dynasty. His son Edward, later called the Elder, was trained not only in arms but in letters, reflecting Alfred's belief that a king must be both warrior and wise man. His daughters, too, were carefully married into alliances that strengthened the Saxon position across Britain. Despite his labors, Alfred was often weighed down by the sense of unfinished work. He knew that the Danes still controlled vast swaths of England. He knew that his reforms, fragile as they were, could be undone by careless successors. He often prayed that God would grant him just enough time to secure the future of his people. "I am but a steward," he confessed to Asser. "I hold this land for a little while, and then I must give it back. May I not be found wanting." By the mid-890s, Alfred's health was failing. The mysterious illness that had tormented him from youth grew more frequent and more severe. Yet even as his body weakened, his spirit seemed to burn brighter. He remained active in councils, still writing when he could, still urging his people toward faith and vigilance. Those around him noticed that he had grown more serene, as though he had already begun to live more in the light of eternity than in the struggles of earth. One of his last recorded acts was to welcome a group of foreign scholars and pilgrims to his court. Though weary and in pain, Alfred rose to greet them, asking eagerly about the state of the church abroad, about the learning of other lands. He gave gifts to the travelers and asked for prayers in return. To the end, he remained both student and servant, longing always for the wisdom that comes from God. At last, in the year 899, Alfred's long journey drew to its close. He was still only about 50 years old, yet his life had been filled with battle, suffering, and labor beyond most men's endurance. He died at Winchester, surrounded by his family and priests. Those who stood by his bed said he met death with peace, his lips moving in prayer, his eyes fixed on the crucifix before him. His body was laid to rest in the old minster, and later moved, though its final resting place has been lost time. His people mourned him deeply, not merely as a king, but as a father. For generations after, Alfred's name was spoken with reverence, and stories of his wisdom, courage, and humility were passed down like sacred inheritance. He alone among English monarchs came to be called the Great. What made him so? Not his victories alone, though they were great. Not his laws or his schools, though they were lasting. It was the unity of his life, warrior, scholar, servant of God, that marked him out. In him, his people glimpsed what it meant for a ruler to be more than powerful, to be just humble and holy. Alfred himself would not have claimed greatness. He would have said only that he had striven to live worthily, and to leave to those who came after him the memory of good works. And indeed, more than 1,000 years later, his memory endures. The boy who once won a book of poetry from his mother, the fugitive who burned cakes in the peasant's hut, the king who prayed psalms on the battlefield, remains a figure both human and heroic, both flawed and faithful. In him, England found not only survival but hope,